So let's review what data binding is. Data binding is the process of getting information from one object to another and then automatically displaying it in one or more elements in your user interface. And the key concept here is automatically. The key benefit to data binding is that there's a link between the data source and data bound elements. So if you change information in an element, the data source is automatically updated, and if the data source changes, then the elements are automatically updated. This is inside the application. Now you don't need to use data binding. You can do this all by hand. So in your Windows Loaded Event Handler, you could query a database and retrieve a list of customers. And then in Code or in XAML, you could set the item source property of a list box to a data table or other object. And then in your code or in XAML, you could set the item source property of a list box to the data table or other object that contains the customers. And at that point, you'd be able to display customers in a list box. And then in the list box's selection changed event handler, you could query the database and retrieve the information for the selected customer. Now you need to display that information in the controls in the window. So, in the list box's selection changed event handler, after you run the query, you could set the text property of each text box to the value of the appropriate column of customer data, one at a time. And then in the Save button's click event handler, you could read the value of each text box and update the appropriate column of customer data in whatever object's holding the data table or an object, and then you could save the changes back to the database. Now if you're using data binding, you still have to query the database and retrieve the list of customers, and you still have to set the item source property of the list box to display the customers. And then when the user selects a customer, you still need to query the database and bring back the information for the selected customer, but you don't have to write the code that populates the elements in the window, and then when it comes time to save the changes, you just send the changes back to the database, because the elements on the window and the data table or object that contains the customers are in sync. You still have to do your data code, but you don't have to write any code to get information out of the data source into elements on the window and back again. So you save yourself a huge amount of work. Where does data come from in a WPF data application? Essentially, you have the same options as you have in Windows Forms applications. And you can get data from a number of data sources. From custom business objects, you can use ADO.NET datasets, Link to SQL, Entity Framework, or you can call services, whether they're web services or Windows Communication Foundation services or WCF data services. The WPF runtime doesn't really care where the data comes from. Data binding works the same. The simplest option is if you're binding to an object. So we're going to see a demo where we display clients in a list box. And we're going to create a collection of clients in code, populate the collection, and then bind to an object in XAML, and that object is going to be the list of clients. And the XAML we're going to use looks like this. We'll have a list box, and we'll set the item source to the client's object in the binding to object class. That binding to object class is the window. And we'll have a public property called clients, which will be a generic list of instances of a client class. And then in the list box, we're going to display the name of the client. And then the user can select a client from the list box, and we'll display the details for that client in data-bound text boxes in a grid. And you bind the grid by setting the data context to the selected list box item, which is an instance of the client class in our example. And then the text boxes in the grid inherit the data binding. WPF has a containership model, so if you set the data context of a grid, the text boxes in the grid have the same binding. And so what we'll do is set the data context to the selected item from the list box. So this says when you select an item in the list box, bind the grid to that item, and then the text boxes will display properties of that item. So in this case, this will be the name of the client. We'll next see an example where we're going to bind to a data table. We're going to use ADO.NET datasets. And again, we'll display customers in a list box and details for each selected customer in text boxes in a grid. We're going to have two versions of this demo. The first uses a table adapter to retrieve customers, and the second uses an intermediary data layer. But in both cases, the customers are in a data table. Then we're going to set the item source property of the list box to the customers table, and that displays customers in the list box. And then again, the data context of the grid is set to the selected item in the list box, and therefore the text boxes automatically update when you select a new customer. And then in the selection changed event handler for the list box, we're going to run a query and bring back the number of orders placed by that customer. Using ADO.NET datasets is pretty traditional, but there are other options for working with data, such as link. So we'll see an example of binding to a link query. Again, we're going to display customers in a list box and details in a grid, and then we're going to run a link to SQL query to retrieve customers, and then set the item source property of the list box to the results of that query. And then again, set the data context of the grid to the selected item in the list box, which automatically updates the text boxes. And then again, when we select a customer in the list box, we want to see how many orders have been placed by that customer. And so in the list boxes selection changed event handler, we're going to run a link to SQL query. So far we've been binding to collections of data. Another scenario is binding to one row of data. So we'll see an example where we're going to display information on a single product in a window. The user enters a product ID and clicks the Find button. And we'll see examples of using a table adapter and a link to SQL query to retrieve the information on a single product. And then we're going to set the data context of the grid to the row in the data table that represents that product or the result of the link query. So that's what we're going to do. Let's go do it. I have the Working with Data sample application running. And let's take a look at binding to data. In our first example, we're going to bind to an object. And so in my window, I have a list box that displays clients. And then as I select a client, I see the details in text boxes in the grid. So on the right is the XAML for this window. I have my grid, and then I have my list box, and the item source property is set to this binding expression. I'm going to bind to element name binding to object, path, clients. Well, binding to object is the name of the window. So that is the name of my class. And then clients, what is that? Well, let's go into the code behind this. And here's binding to object, which is the window. And then I have a public property called clients, which is a generic list of clients. And then in the initialize, I'm going to create a new list of clients, and I'm going to create 4 clients. Now, client is a very simple class in this project that just has properties for ID, name, city, and state. So when this window initializes, I create a new list of clients, create 4 of them, and then this public property of the binding to object class is populated. And then in the XAML, I set the item source property to clients. So I have a binding expression, the element name is binding to object, and the path is clients, and that says bind this list box to the public property clients, which is already populated, and display the name. So that's how I get the names of my clients in this list box. And then the grid is bound to the selected item of the list box. And the selected item is an instance of the client class. And so each of the text boxes in the grid display information from the client, and they're bound to properties. So name, city, state. And so as I scroll from item to item in the list box, I'm actually selecting an instance of the client class. The grid is bound to that item, and I can display properties of the item, so information for the client. As I scroll from client to client in the list box, the selected item is a different client. And then the grid is bound to that client, or instance of the client class, and then the text boxes are bound to properties of the client object, and so they display the information on the client. And then if I were to make changes in the text box, then the instance of that client class would also be updated because I'd be writing directly to the properties of it. So the text boxes are bound to properties of the client object because the grid is bound to the currently selected client. So in our next example, and all of the examples after that, we're going to use real data. I just wanted to use fake data here just so we had sort of a level set on binding. So let me close this and close both of these. And now in our next example, we're going to bind to a data table. So in this example, when the window loads, I'm going to display customers from the famous and familiar Northwind database. And then as I select customer after customer in the list box, I display their information in text boxes in the grid. Okay, so let's see what's going on here. Let's also narrow this a little bit. Okay, here's the XAML for the Binding to Data Table 1 page. We'll start off looking at the list box. Notice that in XAML, it's not bound. That's because the binding is occurring in code. So in the window loaded event, I'm going to create a new instance of the dataset, and then get the customer's table adapter and execute its fill method, which basically sends to the SQL server the SQL statement select star from customers. The results come down, and then the customer's table in the dataset is populated. Then I set the item source property of the list box to the customer's table. And therefore, this list box contains all of the customers. Unfortunately, in Northwind, there's only 90-something customers. Obviously, if there were 97 million customers, we wouldn't bring them all down. But Northwind has a nice small amount of data. Okay, let's go back to the XAML, because in the list box, I see not only the customer name, but the city and country. And that's because I'm using an item template. So the item template property of the list box is set to customer template, which is a static resource and is a data template defined up here. And so customer template says display the company name, parentheses, city, comma, space, country, parentheses. And that's one of the nice things about a data template is in a single item in a list box, I can display not just the customer's name, but also the city and the state, and I can do it through this template. So now, why is it that as I go from customer to customer, their information updates in the text boxes in the grid? That's because the grid is bound to the selected item in the list box. And since the list box is displaying rows in a data table, the grid is bound to whatever row I'm on when I select a new customer. And then the text boxes are bound to columns in the row: company name, contact title, etc. Pretty straightforward. So as I move from customer to customer, I'm selecting a different row. The grid's bound to that row. The text boxes display the information in the row. At this point, it kind of feels like Windows Forms, doesn't it? Now I'm also displaying the number of orders placed by the customer down here. Let's go see how I do that. There's a query in the dataset that retrieves the orders for a particular customer. So The SQL statement is basically select count star from orders where customer ID equals whatever. So I create a new instance of the queries table adapter so I can run the orders count method, which is the name of the query. And that's going to take as an argument the customer ID. So how do I find the customer ID? Well, I know that the list box is rows, and I know that sender in this code is the selected item. So I take sender, cast it to a list box, and then get the selected item, which is an object. So I then cast that to data row view so that I can get the row property. So now this is a row in the data table, but I'm going to cast that to the strongly typed customers row class so that I can then type this code .customer ID. So that gets the customer ID of the customer selected in the list box. I pass that to the orders count query, and then I just display that in the orders count text block, which is down here. So each time I select a customer, I'm displaying not only the information for the customer, which is local, but I'm also sending a query back to the database to get the number of orders placed by that customer. So that is binding to data table version 1. Let's close these. Now, binding to data table 2, it looks the same and it acts the same, but in reality, it's a little bit different. If I look at the XAML doesn't look any different. The list box still uses the template. The grid is still bound to the selected item in the list box, but in the code, we're not directly calling a table adapter. We're using our intermediate data layer. So I'm going to create a new instance of the data layer class and call the getCustomers method of that, which returns a data table. And because it's not a strongly typed data table, then when I set the item source, I need to set it to the default view. So if we compare, let's get back binding to data table 1. I could set the item source directly to the customers table because it's strongly typed. But the data layer is returning a weakly typed data table, so I set the item source to the default view. And then after that, everything works the same. Now the data layer, I also kept very, very simple. It calls the table adapter. And then it returns customers as a data table. Now I suppose, thinking about it, that I could have had this return a strongly typed customers table rather than a weakly typed data table, and then I wouldn't have had to bind the list box to the default view. But the way I wrote this, it just returns sort of a generic data table, and then I have to bind to the view. But once I do that, this works exactly the same. Okay, our next example, we're going to bind to a link query. And so what I have in here is a data model, Northwind data classes.dbml. If I double click on that, I know the designer can't be modified while debugging, which is fine because I don't want to modify it, I just want to look at it. So here I've created an object relational model using Link to SQL. So in the Server Explorer, I created a new instance of the Link to SQL classes. Here's my Link to SQL data model. It's the same tables from the Northwind database. And when I have my data model, I can write queries. So now, when this form loads, this binding to a link query, this is going to behave the same way as the other examples. Northwind data classes data context is the data context for my data model, and the data context is responsible for connecting to the data source and managing data. So I create a new instance of that when the window loads, and then I can run a link to SQL query against the customers table. from cust in Northwind data context.customers select cust is the link to SQL equivalent of select star from customers. I can reference the customers table as a property of the data context, and then I just select all of the information for all of the customers. And because this returns an IEnumerable, I can set the item source property of the customer's list box to that. And now, this form behaves the exact same way. I have all of the customers in here. I'm using the same data template. And then let's take a look at the XAML and see what the grid is bound to. Again, same thing. Selected item in the list box. So really in these examples, the only difference is how I'm retrieving the data. Directly through a table adapter, indirectly through a data layer that uses the table adapter, or through a link to SQL query. And then the XAML is exactly the same. And again here, when I select a new customer, I'm displaying the number of orders. And to do that, I run a link query. So my query is from order in orders, where customer ID equals the ID of the customer I've selected. Select order, and then get the count. So this is the link to SQL equivalent of select count star from orders, where customer ID equals whatever I selected. And the link to SQL runtime sends this query back to the database. So just as before, I'm going across the wire to get the orders, the current number of orders for this customer. So that's 3 different examples of retrieving a collection, binding to a collection. The list box is bound to the collection of customers. And so I have a fair amount of data back on the client. In our next example, we want to look at another scenario, which is binding to one row of data at a time. So here, the window shows up with no data. And I'm going to enter a product ID, let's say 15. And when I click Find, I'm going to retrieve the information for that product. Let's look at the XAML for this. I have the Find text box and the Find button. And then the grid is named Product Grid. No data context set, of course. And then the text boxes are bound to the information I want to display. The product name, the category name, the supplier name, etc. Now let's look at the code that runs. Let's move this up and then get the form back. There. So when the window loads, I create a new instance of the data set, and then I get a reference to the product info table adapter. And the product info table adapter has a query in it called fill by product ID, which is going to retrieve the product name and other product information, and then the category name and the supplier name. So it's basically a 3-table join, because I want the category name from the category table and the supplier name from the supplier table. I don't want to just display the category ID and the supplier ID. So when I click the Find button, I'm going to run this query, fill by product ID, and pass to it the name of the table to fill, which is product info, and the product ID, which is whatever I typed in the Find text box converted to an integer. If that returns 0, then there's no product, whatever. So if I enter here 150,001, there is no product 150,001. But if I enter a product that does exist, then the fill by product ID query runs and fills the product info table with the results. There should be one row. I shouldn't have multiple products with the same ID. If I do, I'm just going to ignore the second one. So I'm going to set the context of the window to the first row in the results that come back. And again, I'm taking advantage of the XAML containership model. If I set the context of the window, then all of the controls in the window have the same data context. In our previous examples, we set the data context of the grid. Here, I can set the data context of the window. Then the grid inherits that data context, and each of the text boxes inherits that data context. And therefore, everything in the window is bound to whatever row of data I'm looking at. So that example uses table adapters. In our next example, we're going to use a link query. So again, it works the same way. The XAML is exactly the same, but let's look at the code. I'm going to create a new instance of Northwind data class's data context, which is my data context, my link to SQL data context. Then I'm going to execute a link to SQL query from prod in Northwind data context.products, where the product ID is equal to whatever was entered into the text box. Select new, and then I want product name, which is in the product table. I want the category name and the supplier name. One of the big benefits of link to SQL is that the product class has a property called category, which is set to an instance of the category class. So it's set to the category that that product's in. So to get the category name for product, I can say prod.category.category name. And to get the supplier name, it's prod.supplier.company name. And then I get the quantity per unit, unit price, in stock, and on order. And so now product is the result of this query. If the count's equal to 0, then there is no product of that number. Otherwise, I set the data context of the window to the results of the query. And again, the results of the query should be one product. If it's more than one product, then that's being ignored. So I'm displaying in the text boxes information for that product. So what you've seen in this demo are some fairly common data scenarios. In the first scenario, we bring down a list of customers, and as we scroll from customer to customer in the list box, we display the information in data-bound text boxes on the grid. And then in the second scenario, we can bring down information on one product at a time and display that information in data-bound text boxes in a grid. And we saw a variety of ways of getting that information, but the XAML and the data binding work exactly the same way.